somehow in the spirit of the roots and shoots, which was given out as the theme. So I thought that on the one hand, I would like to refer to some very basic themes of the group, but on the other hand, try to tell what I have been working on in a very actual context. So what my presentation refers to a reading that you have had the possibility to read, which was written by Olesen, also an old member of the group, and myself, under the impression of the Corona COVID lockdown. And in a way, you could say that what we have done is to take the opportunity to reflect on this situation while nurturing some basic interests, which I've tried to summarize in a slide. So you would say that on the one hand, I'm interested in elaborating on the concept of the societal unconscious, which is, so to say, the for me a core in the dialectic that we are trying to study the societal nature of the unconscious and unconscious psychodynamic dimensions of society is somehow the very basic focus, and was also the theme of the book that I edited last year. And then the more specific theme is to understand the psychodynamic dimensions of political processes, and that's what I'm trying to pursue in the following. I hope you have had the opportunity, or not only had the opportunity, but that you have taken the opportunity to read the article that Åse and I sent out. By the way, bring my Åse's regards. She doesn't feel that she's still so much involved in the groups that she wanted to participate, but of course she is an old member and know many of you know her. In this article we have made a kind of analysis of the Danish government handling of the COVID crisis under the perspective of seeing it in a way as a scene. That is a ball I want to play to Christine's to the discussion of Christine's presentation, to see the relation between government and people as a group relation or a scene, which could be interpreted as such, but of course in this way also stretching the concept of scene, and that is to say the empirical horizon of our interpretation. That's one thing that I would like to discuss also on the basis of this, because the method we have used is on the one hand reading of texts which were speeches by the Prime Minister during the initial phases of the COVID lockdown, but not trying not to read them only as in terms of discourse analysis, but also reading them in terms of their emotional relativity and appeal. Whereas on the other hand, we have used as part of our basis what you might in this methodological term call participatory observation. Actually, we were triggered off in this work by our own feelings and reactions to the situation of the COVID-19 and but especially of the layer on the top of the real crisis. There was the societal definition of that crisis, which was implemented by the government in a specific way, which was very dramatic in Denmark. What I'm going to discuss is not the strategies of dealing with COVID, not the efficiency of strategies, not the outcome and so on, but it is a part of our observation, and it influenced our thinking very much, that the crisis was so dramatically defined by the government and by the government handling. What was a kind of initial observation, which was interesting, was that Danish people, who are generally seen as relatively non-authoritarian, relaxed, very quickly turned into very obedient citizens in this context of the pandemic close down or lockdown. Not only by so to say supporting in opinions, but in changing everyday habits. So when we walked around and observed how people acted bodily, we saw a kind of very obedient behavior, which you had then to relate to, because you were always yourself involved in these interactions. How serious should one take the risks of contamination, and how serious should one take the advice about precautions which were given by authorities and so on. So you had to, so to say, on an everyday basis, do an interpretation of a behavior which seemed quite unusual. What, as I said, we then tried to say what's happening here. What is this relation between the government or the prime minister, who stepped very much to the front, and the people, the citizens, and at least, and then the interest was to also to see this as a political process, and as it developed, it became quite much a political observation, and that's what will come afterwards. Then I would just make a little step backwards, because this doing psychodynamic interpretation of political processes, I would like to remind about the analysis of the atrocities in Yugoslavia, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and I've been working with that for many years, and we have discussed it a couple of times in the SQUID circle. And in the end, it crystallized in a kind of analysis of this process, which was quite much inspired by Volkan. Volkan is a psychoanalyst who has been engaged in analyzing political conflicts and also in conflict resolution. He wrote a couple of articles analyzing especially the Serbian self-understanding and investment in the subjective investment in the conflict in the Balkans or in Yugoslavia. He does so using key concepts which he calls large group identity, and another one which is especially coined for Serbians, which he calls chosen trauma, analyzing the position and self-understanding of of Serbians and the hostility and alienation against other nationalities and other religions by means of this idea of interpreting the history as an offense against an injustice against Serbia, and as a misrecognition of Serbia as a warrior people who have defended Christian values against the Turks and so on. And you could say that his analysis is clearly psychoanalytic. It's a kind of collective splitting defense mechanism that he's doing as the main explanation of the otherwise unbelievable and understandable hostilities and aggressions, hatred. If you, some of you have been very young when the Yugoslavian dissolution developed, but you could say that this is really the post-Second World War most violent and incredible breakdown of civilization in the form of conflict between national groups and religious groups. It was also a point in that analysis to try to spell out a feeling that there was in this psychological, psychodynamic explanation of social behavior some shortcomings, which has to do then with the societal dimension in our shared mission of psychosocietal or psychosocial. And I've summarized it in two items. So one is that the socioeconomic context is downplayed, that it was a crisis which had to do with the breakdown of the Yugoslavian modernization process, which was informed by extensive unemployment and economic breakdown and institutional failure. And the other thing, which is a little more special, but also very fundamental in emotional sense, the usual, I would say, in Serbian, in modernization processes, a usual observation of homeless masculinity, which we link to the very sexualized violence in this conflict. It's not unusual that there is sexual violence in war situations. It's unfortunately always the case, and it can be explained in several ways. But it was very, very marked at it. It was integrated in an ideological message of genocidal interest in the sexualized violence, which I think has to do then with a very deep crisis of masculinity in these societies. So in a way, these critiques would then be ideas about things that could have made a more rich understanding of why the conflict had the nature it had. But it also touches on a theme that I'm going to pursue a little more, namely that it's a very bleak, a very dark analysis, and mostly when we apply psychodynamic analysis on social conflicts, it turns out to be explanations of why people are uncivilized in one or another way, or aggressive, or violating others. And so I think to try to work out this societal dimension might also have to do with understanding conflict in a more nuanced way than to take so to say, take out the tool of psychodynamics when the rational understanding comes to an end, which I think is very often the case. We have a parallel in a way in discussion about right-wing right-wing authoritarianism in Europe as a new political development that is hard to explain, and it becomes then understandable by means of psychodynamic frameworks. But I think so. I would be looking out for a more nuanced understanding of psychodynamic dimensions of political processes, and that's what I'm going to highlight or to maybe give a prioritized attention, but also thereby linking it more directly to a societal concepts and to the societal dimension. So leaving Yugoslavia behind, but just to establish it, yeah, roots and shoots, a continuity of issues. If we understand the Danish government,
just quick,
yeah.
There was Katarina has a question.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up your question before you move on, Henning. Can you say something about the homeless masculinity? Why homeless?
Well, because in the transition from a rural agricultural society, partly pre-modern, which has been very much involved in conflicts down the history, there was and is actually still in Serbia a kind of a warrior culture and an understanding of a real man being also a warrior who is defending himself and the women and the civilization, in this case the Christian civilization, against the Muslims in Bosnia, for example. And in modern society, you could say, at best cases, as we know from masculinity research, this masculinity finds a new home in the provider role, where you become able to be a wage labor, earn your money, maybe make big achievements. And so, but we still see in modernizing societies, for example, also a overrepresentation of suicides among young men in Greenland, for example, which can be interpreted as also some of this homelessness if the transmission into a provider, wage labor, modern man doesn't succeed, and I think half of us approximately know that this is not problems which are out of history, but they have a very marked presence in these transitional societies.
Thank you.
Well, what I want to do now is a little schematic to say, if we now see this COVID management, which was very efficient, but that's not my theme, as a case of mass psychological manipulation or using the situation of anxiety to call for an identification with the leadership and to form a group, an authoritarian group where you delegate your political orientations and your agency to a leader, which is, so to say, a schematic version of the authoritarian way of mass psychology, which so to say desubjectivizing, or asking, making people delegate their super ego, if you want to put it in that term, to a leadership, and suspending your own responsibility and your own ethical concerns. Then you could say, well, in many ways, this management had similarity with such mass psychology, and it continues also in the sense that the style of the Danish government is rather authoritarian, at least for a social democrat, left-wing social democrat political leadership. But I want to fix on this, that you could see it in that way, and it worked. And it worked for a long time. It didn't work forever. There is a bill to be paid later on in this political process, but it worked in the first place. Then there are some nuances in relation to this traditional authoritarian use of mass psychology, that the threat in this case is accidental. It's anxiety provoking, but it's coming from destiny. You could compare with the Trump's attempt to make a usual splitting. It's the Chinese virus, so it's the evil of the enemy, China, who is responsible for the evil affecting US. But this is not. This is also seen as very very extreme. Normally, the threat is seen as a biological threat. But still then treated as a threat to all of us. But then the speeches which we have analyzed refer to very strongly. They are very, very good speeches, very, very well made rhetoric of creating the identity and the direct relation between the leader and the people, and the presentation of the prime minister as a very ordinary person, which is also part of her general spin of presenting a very ordinary woman who presents her private life as part of a political persona. But what was very important was that the speeches also refer to the Nordic or national experience of the welfare state. We used to be able to help each other. When there is an emergency, you can count on being helped. And in this way, which is our interpretation, then also plays on the confidence in authorities, the relative confidence, which is something that positivist sociologist has also measured, that Nordic citizens have high confidence in authorities, and especially this state idea that the state will save you in the end. But then there is also a very interesting nuance in relation to the political dimension, namely that the prime minister appeals very directly to individual agency. Together we can stand against this, and the survival of the elderly and the weak people depends on each individual acting together with other individuals, following the prescriptions from authorities about the keeping the distance and using the ethanol and so on. So so there is something which, at least for people who have a certain strong relation with this idea of the social democrat welfare state, there is a markedly new nuance in appealing to people. You could almost cut short saying that normally this has been the picture developed by the social democrat welfare societies. The state will help all those who need. But in this case, it's almost the other way around, because the real threat in this situation was presented as the breakdown of the health services because of overload. So the appeal was almost that you, the citizens, by your individual agency, must save the state. You see, it's an upside down in relation to usual social democrat ideology. And in a way, this is, of course, very interesting. Does this mean that this government, which is left social democrat, trying to revive the old values of classical social democracy, rather authoritarian style, does it mean that they also launch a new participatory idea about the state? I think we think it's present in this way of appealing to the citizens, and this is so very interesting. Now I have to think about the time. It's interesting because the social democrats welfare state is, as you could say, the Nordic version is epitome of an idea of a welfare state which is widespread, but it's also in a crisis of legitimacy across Europe. I think SPD is going to have 10% of the votes in Germany, whereas Social Democrats were not in Germany, but across Europe, one of the core political forces. So the question would be, in this context, the Prime Minister has become famous among her party companions across Europe that she has been able to turn the voters. But it's also, you could ask, is it a new social democrat narrative which is being launched here, namely something like a participatory democracy or a collective subjectivity, as opposed to the concrete state which will be able to manage for everyone, but unable to be sensitive to individual interests. So in this sense, on the one hand, the real existing historical experience of welfare state, I think, is part of the part of the group identification that is established between the leader and the people. But on the other hand, it also seems like opening for a new understanding of the state in the social democrat context. And this leads me to raise some questions like, must group identifications always be an authoritarian power strategy? How do we treat crowds where the identifications are with a cause, not with an authoritarian leader per se, but with some kind of justified cause where similar psychodynamic group relations may sometimes occur? And at the end, of course, asking if there is a dimension here of building a democratic collective subject, instead of the state institution as subject in the classical social democrat narrative, or instead of a new authoritarian group identity as is demonstrated by the prime minister in this sense. And theoretically, you could just refer to the question about I mentioned beyond the good group, which is open to disagreement, but still remains the nature of a group. That is, so to say, the question which is posed on the political level. And my point is then to say, can we analyze psychodynamic relations and processes in a way which illuminates the political and institutional level in a question about, so to say, collective subjectivity. That was then also the title of my presentation. Is it mass psychology we are seeing here, or is it a building of a collective subjectivity? And the point is, of course, that it is both or open, or it is a matter of interpretation. The continuation of the story has not been very encouraging, because the authoritarian side of the government policy has been continued, and so to say, the opening of a participatory process, paying respect to the individual engagement and necessity of the individual engagement, has not been very clear. And in the end, without trying to inform about Danish policy processes, we have had a decline in these openings. But there's also one theme that I just want to bring in, and then I will, I think, almost keep my time. And that is the fact that the appeal of the Prime Minister was and is still directed to the Danes. In those speeches we analyzed, there's only once appeal, a reference to the citizens or people. The appeal is to the Danes, and you could then say, given the fact of big conflicts about immigration policy and the fact that this government has taken over the right wing, restrictive, rather nationalistic handling of immigration. At first for tactical reasons and very successfully, but maybe also as a strong identification with exactly the welfare state as a property of us Danes. And if you read these speeches and you say that you could ask if this is appealing to the Danes, is that a nationalistic exclusion, or is it an invitation to citizens of a foreign background to join in the community? That is to say, if you join in and behave in the right way, then you are a Dane. And there has been plenty of political discussions and media stunts during the COVID conflict, where this immigration theme has played a significant role. Those immigrants, they cannot follow the rules. They have higher contamination. Is that because they have poor housing conditions, or what? So this has been kind of political discussions. So you could say that this question about the Danes is a kind of a side theme in this context, but it's also interwoven with the overall theme of, is there a new concept of state and relations between state and citizens built into this very successful mobilization of individual obedience. Yes, I got Jan. And of course, then this would be my forward direction to say, can we analyze group processes and political processes in a way which opens for such a an alternative of what would you call it in English, of regressive mobilization and identification versus opening for a dialogical searching form of subjectivity. And beyond the good group could be kind of search concepts. Yeah, the rest is references, or the rest is silence. The two things can be combined in an invitation to read some of this. There is a Danish book included, so which is only for our Nordic, relevant for Nordic colleagues, but otherwise all those that I have referred to.